The Affluent Society, Foreign Policy.
I'm A.
And I am M. The EEC attempts to join and making of the EFTA.
The founding of the EEC was based upon the Schuman Plan of 1950. It consisted of proposals for a coal and steel community that would integrate French and German heavy industry to promote rapid economic reconstruction and eliminate future wars between the two countries to secure peace. Task: can you remember what the EEC stands for?
1. Britain and the United States supported this for security of Europe, which was seen as vital at the start of the Cold War. After 1945, there had been significant movement among the Western European nations towards mutual cooperation.
Britain did not initially join because few politicians or journalists were in favour of Britain taking up a leadership role in Europe. At the time, if the EEC's establishment, it was not clear how successful the Big Six would be, the Big Six being France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. The left was suspicious of the free market principles behind the common market. They regarded the EEC as a capitalist club, membership of which would hamper Britain's development of a socialist economy. The right wanted preservation of traditional trade links, for example Australia, Canada, New Zealand, over Europe. Britain had won the war, making relations difficult. There was an assumption that Britain was still a great world power. Britain wanted to balance its involvement in Europe while maintaining the special relationship. After the Treaty of Rome was made in 1955, confirming the launch of the EEC in 1957, de Gaulle was determined to keep the partnership from Les Anglo-Saxons. The treaty's key terms were as follows: the establishment of a common market and a customs union to monitor all aspects of trade between the member states, the adoption of a common agricultural policy, CAP. Member states were required to operate a protectionist policy against all non-member nations.
Third, British attitudes began to shift. Britain wanted economic growth, so took the lead in the EFTA, European Free Trade Association, in 1959. This alternative to the EEC was eventually made in 1960, but failed to match the economic growth of the EEC.
Britain applied to the EEC in 1961. Macmillan's government did this because it was believed it would boost industrial production for a large-scale export market, it would increase industrial efficiency with greater competition, it would stimulate economic growth with the rapid economic expansion already seen with the EEC. There was a belief that Britain's imperial power had been shaken by Suez and accelerating pace of decolonisation. Europe, as it was hoped that the EEC would boost industrial production with a new export market that would increase competition and encourage economic expansion.
Fifth, the USA wanted Britain to join because Britain was seen as a vital link between Europe and America, and tensions were rising in the late 1950s in the Cold War.
Key terms: why did Britain fail to join the EEC in 1963? Special relationship with USA. A relationship based on historical, diplomatic, cultural, economic and military ties between two countries. It was strengthened by being key allies during the Cold War, sharing the common objective of resisting the power of the USSR.
6. Negotiations were difficult. Britain wanted to keep its position in the Commonwealth and USA. EEC had developed economic structures Britain found difficult to conform to, e.g. common agricultural policies, so special exemptions had to be sought. This took months of bargaining led by Edward Heath. Negotiations seemed successful but were blocked by de Gaulle in 1963. This shocked the other countries, caused bad relations between Britain and France, and Britain remained outside the EEC. The EEC had already developed detailed economic structures, especially the common agricultural policy, that Britain found difficult to conform to. Special exemptions for Britain's Commonwealth trade partners, such as lamb exports from New Zealand, which would have been backed by EEC regulation, had to be sought. This took many months of bargaining, led on the British side by Macmillan's chief negotiator, Ted Heath. The negotiations seemed to have reached a successful conclusion in January 1963, but at the last minute, the French president exercised France's right to veto and blocked Britain's application. De Gaulle's interventions was a bombshell. The other five member of states were as shocked and disappointed as Britain, but were unable to persuade de Gaulle to carry on with negotiations. His bad relations caused problems with relations between France and Britain.
Relations with the USA and USSR. Britain, USA and USSR had been allies in World War II. Britain and USA remained allies and opposed the expansion of communism, especially across Europe, after the war. Task: watch this video which demonstrates the special relationship.
What was the Cold War? The Cold War was an ongoing political rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union and the respective allies that developed after World War II. Communism versus individualist. Soviet Union controlled most of Western Europe, Czechoslovakia, Poland and Hungary, former Nazi-occupied, and China. Threat of nuclear war, competition over the allegiance, loyalty of newly independent nations, military and economic support of each other's enemies around the world.
Britain became a founding member of NATO in 1949. Britain and USA as close allies. Britain supported the USA through the Cold War and worked with USA to sustain West Berlin. Britain supported the UN in Korea, and Kennedy kept Macmillan informed on the Cuban Missile Crisis. The special relationship allowed Britain to retain a place at the international top table. Task: watch this video on the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis.
3. Special relationship under strain. The Burgess and Maiden Affair, 1951. Britain's relationship with the EEC, 1963. The Suez Crisis of 1956. The Burgess and Maiden were highly placed officers in Britain's intelligence. They defeated the Soviet Union in 1951. 3 years after, there were concerns about finding the third man who had tipped them off. The relation that Britain's suspicious spies had been leaking vital information / secrets to Moscow. This deeply worried America, who became much less ready to share secrets with Britain.
Debates over the nuclear deterrent. The Labour government after the war had committed Britain to developing an independent nuclear deterrent. The US stopped sharing nuclear secrets with Britain, so Britain had to become a nuclear power itself. Task: can you remember who was in power before Churchill? What caused Labour divisions in the 1950s?
1. Churchill continued this policy. In 1952, Britain first tested its atomic bomb. Britain was now the third country to develop nuclear weapons. Task: based on what we just learned about the Cold War, what countries do you think made their atomic bombs first?
Britain was behind. The USA and the USSR had already made an atomic bomb. They both were developing H-bombs as well. Britain had only tested their H-bomb in 1957. So, task: watch this video on Britain's H-bomb.
Concerns over nuclear developments led to the formation of the CND in 1958. The CND wanted Britain to follow a policy of unilateral nuclear disarmament. 80,000 people took part in a demonstration at a weapons research base in Aldermaston in 1958. This happened again at a larger scale in 1959. Unilateralism was a powerful magnet for an anti-government protest. Left Labour joined.
In 1958, America shared nuclear technology with Britain again, under the Mutual Defence Agreement. Britain's rocket Blue Streak was abandoned in 1960 in favour of the American Polaris submarine weapon system. It became clear that Britain would not have an independent nuclear deterrent. Labour became sceptical of supporting pro-nuclear policy.
Korean War, 1950 to 1953. After the Second World War, Korea, which had before been ruled by Japan, was occupied by the Soviet Union. in the north and USA in the south. Two separate governments were set up, claiming to be legitimate.
From 1950, forces from North Korea, Soviet Union and China invaded the south. The UN condemned the action and sent in forces to combat the invasion. Over 20 countries supplied troops, and Britain sent 90,000 soldiers, which was the second largest amount after the USA.
2. There was heavy fighting and a stalemate, a ceasefire, which was agreed in 1953. 1,000 British troops died. Korea would be split between communist North and non-communist South.
Britain was still military overstretched and very dependent on Americans' power. The Korean War showed that the Cold War was being fought across the globe, and it showed Britain's willingness to play a major role in world affairs despite economic constraints. It was clear that the USA was a greater power.
Suez, 1956. Suez Canal was the main artery connecting trade routes. 1. The vital route for oil shipments. 80% of Western Europe's oil imports pass through it. The Suez is a shipping canal through the 100 miles desert between Africa and Asia. British PM Benjamin Disraeli bought Egypt's shareholding for $4 million, establishing Britain's influence in the running of his new and extremely important waterway. The Suez Canal provided Britain with a shorter sea route to its empire, and as the 20th century dawned and oil grew in importance, it provided a short sea route to the oil fields of the Persian Gulf. Britain was therefore committed to protect the canal.
Britain's strategic interests were affected by Egyptian independence under new national leader Colonel Nasser. The USA and Britain planned to invest in the Aswan Dam but pulled out in 1956, so Nasser announced the nationalisation of the Suez Canal Company to provide finance needed for the dam.
4. Anthony Eden, who was an expert on foreign policy, but his understanding of the situation was based upon belief Britain was an imperial power, and he was influenced by his dislike of the policy of appeasement. He thought that Nasser was an evil dictator and wanted action. He was encouraged by France and Israel. He agreed Israeli forces would attack. British and French forces would then intervene. This was an excuse to enforce peace. Task: how would the policy of appeasement affect Eden's actions? Write down everything you can remember about Eden.
The details of this manipulation was kept from Parliament in USA. A plan was put into operation on the 29th of October, but military action did not go smoothly, and this caused a storm of political protest in Britain. The Labour Party opposed it, anti-war protesters and public opinion split on need for intervention. The USA opposed action, and Britain was not strong enough to stand up to the USA's pressure. Britain was plunged into a financial crisis, and the UK was running out of fuel.
7. Britain's reputation was damaged. Eden's reputation was damaged, and Britain's position in the world was brought into reassessment. It questions Britain's reputation as a force for good. It highlighted inability to act without US support, and it highlighted impact Britain's economic and financial policy had on foreign policy. Was Britain still a world power?
Decolonisation and the winds of change. In 1951, Britain's retreat from the empire had begun, with the withdrawal of India in 1947. In the 1950s, the pressures of colonial independence movement became hard to contain. One commonly held view that when Britain gave up its empire during the second half of the 20th century, it suffered a serious economic loss. However, the imperial balance sheets revealed that Britain as a nation had paid out more in grants and aid than it had made profits. At the end of the war in 1945, Britain, having agreed in 1940 to pay all India's war costs, found itself owing a sum of 1,200 million. It was not the deterrent. It was the same story with the colonies overall. Britain was in debt to them by the end of the war of 454 million.
What was the impact of Britain's empire? In the end, the empire was abandoned, not because it was making too little, but because it was costing too much. Macmillan was doubtless sincere when he publicly supported the principle of colonial independence. Nevertheless, the basic reason why Britain ceased to be an imperial power was because it could not afford to remain one.
1. Belief in the early 1950s. Britain believed that they could manage the transition from empire to the new Commonwealth, that colonial resistance could be controlled until they were ready for independence. The impact of the Mau Mau Rebellion in 1952. There was a struggle to contain the Mau Mau Rebellion, demonstrated problems with Britain's colonial policies. After Suez in 1956, Britain reconsidered their pace of decolonisation. 1947, withdrawal from India. During the 1950s, pressures of colonial independence movements were harder to contain. British forces were fighting against national independence movements. 1952, start of the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya. Leader Jomo Kenyatta imprisoned and later became the president. The struggle led to bitterness from both sides. Brutal treatment at Hawala prison camp. 1957, Ghana. Ghana became the first of Britain's African colonies to be granted independence. 1960, Macmillan's Wind of Change speech. Speech at Cape Town, a change in policy seeking decolonisation. 1960, Nigeria and Cyprus were granted independence. 1961, South Africa leaves the Commonwealth, as South Africa preferred to follow minority white in referendum later and broke all allies with Britain. 1963, Kenya were granted independence.
3. 1960s, Macmillan's Winds of Change. This called for decolonisation and recognition of independence movements. The policy was successful and decolonisation was completed swiftly and with far less violence than other colonial powers. Historian Bernard Porter has written, "The process of losing an empire had little effect on British politics. Life in the metropolis went on much as before. The rest of is lived through it hardly noticing." That's everything. Thank you.
Bye.